Hello and welcome to Connected with Latham, where we discuss ideas, legal developments, and business trends shaping the global economy. This is the 24th episode of the Latham & Larkin's Drug Pricing and Market Access series, and I'm Chris Schott, a partner in the Healthcare and Life Sciences practice in our Washington, D.C. office. I focus my practice on all things market access, and that includes manufacturer compliance related to the Medicaid Drug Rebate Program, Medicare Parts B and D, and the 340B Drug Pricing Program. I also advise on current policy initiatives, such as the evolving Most Favored Nation drug pricing issues, such as GLOBE and GUARD, the ongoing implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as state law developments. Joining me is Danny Machado, an associate in our Washington, D.C. office.
Hey, Chris, how's it going? Great to be here.
Thanks for joining, Danny. We are very fortunate today to have Sabrina Aery as a guest. Sabrina has many years of experience in the pharmaceutical industry, and not just with the U.S., but with global focus as well. I don't think I've ever seen a list of skills on LinkedIn as expansive as Sabrina's, and I'll mention just a few highlights, such as, of course, Medicaid 340B, but then immune oncology, strategic planning, contract negotiation, pharmaceutical sales, and my favorite, cross-functional team leadership. Sabrina, I've said a few things here, but welcome and thanks for joining the podcast today, and maybe I can turn it over to you so you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris and Danny. So as you mentioned, I've had a long career in healthcare, and that shows, I guess, in my LinkedIn skills with 35 years in the healthcare industry. I recently founded Aery Policy and Access Partners, which is a strategic advisory consultancy to life sciences companies and their advisors. Most of my years in healthcare have been working for either Eli Lilly or more recently Bristol Myers Squibb, where I've spent most of my career. And as you've mentioned, I've had roles spanning both global and U.S. and market access, and then also worked in U.S. policy agency-facing roles. So, Chris, thank you so much for inviting me to this discussion with you and Danny. I'm so happy to be here today. And honestly, sincerely thank you for all the years of collaboration, guidance, and helping our business be more compliant and grow as we face many, many challenges. And I'm an avid listener of the podcast, so excited to be a part of episode 24.
Sabrina, thank you so much for your kind words and for being here. And we really look forward to hearing your insights here today as we get into the podcast. So in each episode, we focus on a specific topic that is relevant to market access, drug pricing, or the pharmaceutical and healthcare sectors more broadly. And after discussing the substance, we ask the question, which Olympic sport is it like? And we have the list of Olympic sports here ready to go to see which most resembles our topic in terms of strategy, complexity, or frankly, level of conflict. So Danny, what is our focus for today?
Well, Happy New Year to all our listeners. We've made it to 2026. A lot has happened in 2025 in our market access and drug pricing space. Probably the most significant event being the release of the GLOBE and GUARD mandatory payment models that came on December 19, 2025. So we thought it might make sense today to draw on Sabrina's experience and expertise to review a bit of what happened in 2025. And it may also help us as we are trying to read the tea leaves a bit and what the outlook of 2026 might look like.
Yeah, thanks, Danny, for kicking off the conversation. And one major question, maybe going chronologically here a little bit, that we had coming into last year, into 2025, was how the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, would fare under the Trump administration, and particularly the drug pricing so-called negotiation program. So now, 12 months later, we know that while Trump talks about the IRA in negative terms usually, quietly, he has continued implementation of the IRA negotiation program, which really is a price capping mechanism, as if there really had been no change in administration at all. We've just seen the rollout quietly continue. So Sabrina, what are some IRA-related observations that you had in 2025?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. First of all, as you mentioned, I watched closely the quote unquote negotiation of the second round of MFP prices and when they were published, comparing those to the previous year. And as you mentioned, it was business as usual from that aspect of how they got to the prices. And then also the iPay 2028 guidance was very big, I think, in 2025. This was proposed guidance. Two things stood out to me. One was that CMS would no longer publish ASP for Medicare Part B MFP drugs when those MFPs are in effect. I think that was pretty earth-shattering to a lot of stakeholders. And then second, maybe positive, was them signaling that they would like additional stakeholder feedback before they finalize this year in rulemaking how to effectuate the Medicare Part B price.
Sabrina, like you said, IPAY 2028 guidance, it's significant. And a couple other reasons is that for the first time in 2028, Part B as in boy drugs will become subject to negotiation. And actually, we expect that list of drugs for IPAY 2028 to be announced pretty soon now, anytime before February 1st of this year, which is 2026. And then second, 2028 would be the last year that CMS can implement the program through guidance. So what this means is that we can now expect notice and comment rulemaking for IPAY 2029.
Yeah, and the IRA statutory provisions actually provide that for Part B drugs that are selected, the reimbursement rate is not ASP plus 6, but then MFP plus 6. So like Sabrina said, we can expect to see significant impacts here on the buy and bill and provider space. And then looking into 2026, right, as of January 1st, the first 10 drugs that were selected and negotiated right now have their maximum fair prices or MFPs actually go into effect. So this is the first time we've seen that. So in the future, you might be asked, where were you when the first MFPs kicked in? And in my case, I was in the basement. But anyway, Sabrina, the IRA was enacted in 2022. So the industry has had some time to analyze the impacts. What have you heard in terms of impacts of IRA price capping and price controls?
Yeah, I think to me what really stands out is what's going on around R&D investment on any drug that could be subject to an MFP coming up relatively soon. I think the National Pharmaceutical Council, who I follow closely, has put out two really, really interesting pieces on this in 2025, and it's worth taking a look. One is a Value in Health article where they saw that the net present values for small molecule drugs decreased by 95%, while biologics experienced a reduction of 45% when you look at things in terms of investment in the trial and how that relates to forecasting. Another very good piece was published in Health Affairs by NPC, where they just found that the monthly post-approval oncology trials fell by 40%. It's just staggering, with sharper declines for small molecule drugs at 45% and biologics at 32%.
Yeah, thanks for giving some factual foundation here. We've certainly been hearing anecdotal evidence for the decline in R&D, and some CEOs of certain companies have publicly stated, especially on the small molecule space, that they're cutting things back. But it's really helpful for you to point us to some of these data-driven sources, because enough time has now passed, so we have the hard evidence for what this impact is really going to look like. There was actually one positive development regarding the IRA in 2025. The so-called One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which in actuality is called HR 1, made a pretty significant improvement to the orphan drug exclusion from the negotiation program. Danny, can you tell us a little bit about that change?
Sure, Chris, that's a great point. Specifically, the orphan drug exclusion no longer being limited to drugs with a single orphan designated indication. The updated orphan drug exclusion covers products that are designated for one or more rare diseases or conditions, so long as they are only approved for the multiple orphan designated indications. And also, the other part of this is that for purposes of the qualifying single source drug definition, or QSSD definition, the applicable 7 or 11-year period after approval or licensure begins on the first day after the date of the approval or licensure that the product does not meet the statutory orphan drug exclusion criteria. That's a mouthful, right? So it basically doesn't start to run with the FDA approval, which is positive. These are generally thought to be improvements to the orphan drug exclusion from negotiation. But as we've been talking about, HR 1 is generally expected to be overall negative for patient access to drugs because it does cut Medicaid significantly, which is something that the OMB has confirmed.
Right. And it does make sense to mention, though, that this change to the orphan drug exclusion re-enables development strategies, which we've seen commonly in the oncology space, where manufacturers will begin with an orphan indication and then later go to a blockbuster indication. and having taken the orphan path to get a faster route to approval. That, of course, was precluded under the original orphan drug exclusion because the timeline to negotiation just began with the first FDA approval. And now, as revised, that strategy of initial approval for orphan indications and adding the so-called blockbuster indication later, that is back on the table. So I think this does give quite a bit of relief to the industry generally, but I think particularly it's relevant in the oncology space. And then, turning back to HR1 and sort of its broader perspective here, maybe, I've certainly heard comments that some of the strategy here is for the Republican side of the House right now to put these Medicaid cuts in place, expecting them to really kick in a few years down the line, forcing a future Congress, possibly then under Democratic control, to deal with the fallout. But we are observing that some of these cuts, maybe unexpectedly, are biting sooner than anticipated. So already right now, there are discussions in the states where providers have problems with the funding cuts already kind of kicking in. So that's another issue to watch, I think, in 2026. So maybe to close out the IRA discussion generally, Sabrina, what are you looking for in 2026 with respect to the IRA?
Yes, a number of things actually in 2026. First, you still have the IRA challenges going on by manufacturers in the courts. They haven't been a smashing success, but expect them to continue in 2026, especially as Part B drugs start to get involved. And speaking of Part B drugs, I'll be watching for the publication of the iPay 2028 drug list, which is supposed to come out either on or before February 1st of 2026, coming up here very shortly. Tied closely to that, I mentioned that CMS mentioned that they would do additional rulemaking this year around IP 2028. So I'll be watching that closely and how that impacts ASP and Medicare Part B effectuation. Also happening just after the publishing of the iPay 2028 list is the publishing in March, on or before March 31st, of the justifications for the Trump administration's first round of price setting with the MFP drugs from iPay 2027. So I'll be watching those justifications closely to see if, one, they mirror the previous year's publication, or they start exposing perhaps a little more clues to the methodology they're using and how they're weighting evidence to guide manufacturers when they're due for future years. Lastly, there's the overlap of IRA requirements like inflation rebates, in addition to MFPs, with our, I'll put it in quotes, Chris, favorite program, the 340B drug pricing program.
Yes, and of course, no discussion like this would be complete without talking about 340B.
Sabrina, I know you have a long history with 340B and deep experience, actually, including participating behind the scenes in a number of efforts trying to improve the program over the years. So I wonder if you could share with us what are some key 340B points from last year, from 2025, that you could share.
Yeah, maybe first put it in perspective, Danny. Let's remind ourselves that 340B is just one part of the puzzle and one part of the trend in 2025 and likely to continue into 2026 of increasing pressure on pharmaceutical gross to nets. Let's start with Medicaid and the AMCAP removal effective in 2024, but we're really starting to see the effects of that in 2025. And anecdotally, a certain number of manufacturers either withdrawing from Medicaid or, pulling drugs from the market. And of course, 340B continues to grow at a more rapid pace year on year. Just this last year, growing at 22% from the previous year versus the year before that, it was 17%. And ongoing concerns with duplicate discounts, with more risk coming from new IRA inflation penalty rebate invoices, MFP effectuation, a lot more duplicate discount exposure for manufacturers to be concerned about. And then lastly, stepping back, looking at the 340B program growth overall, pressures around duplicate discount exposure are even magnified more by the expanding vertical integrations by the big three, all owning 340B TPAs or third-party administrators, on top of retail and specialty pharmacies that also participate in 340B.
Yeah, I mean, those are certainly strong trends to look at. And then there was one pretty significant and novel 340B development in 2025, and that was the introduction of the rebate model by HRSA. So this was prompted by manufacturer litigation, where manufacturers were seeking to vindicate their own implementation of a rebate model. Litigation took place, the government essentially won, although it's the appeal is still going on. But as part of the litigation, HRSA promised that they would issue guidance on a rebate model, and they did. So Sabrina, can you share some thoughts and observations of what happened in 2025 with the rebate model and what you think might happen in 2026?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. HRSA announced the rebate pilot, but unfortunately, they only limited to those drugs subject to maximum fair prices in 2026. And we just talked about the concerns of a manufacturer effectuating an MFP for the first time and trying to figure out how to avoid 340B duplicate discount exposure. So 10 manufacturers were approved with their 10 plans submitted by HRSA. It was supposed to kick off January 1st of 2026 and then was stopped in court by a suit brought by the hospitals and the Hospital Association. HHS appealed that decision, but then very recently withdrew that appeal and indicated that they are going to go back and look at the letters they sent manufacturers. So I think all eyes are going to be on what next steps come from HHS as they take that step back. Will they reappeal the decision in the main courts, or how will they instruct manufacturers? I think it's still playing out in the courts and with HHS. At the same time, you mentioned the manufacturer's appeal to be able to do the rebate model more broadly is still pending in the courts. So I think a lot of pressure on HRSA to respond to manufacturers, and I don't see that letting up in 2026.
Thanks, Sabrina. That makes great sense. So I feel like we've gone through the usual suspects. Inflation Reduction Act implementation is continuing unabated. There might be some movement with the 340B rebate pilot, as Sabrina was just sharing, even while the contract pharmacy mess continues as various states jump in with their own laws to expand the 340B program at a local level. And with that, I wonder if we can turn to what may be the most significant development of 2025, which is sure to impact our industry into 2026, probably beyond. And that is the focus by the Trump administration on international reference pricing, which is where the price for a drug in the United States would be tied to the price for a drug in a basket of countries outside the United States. And while various countries in Europe have reference pricing mechanisms, Donald Trump has been pushing for the most aggressive flavor, which is not looking at an average price in the basket countries, but looking to the lowest price in these basket countries.
Right. And I would not hesitate to say that this MFN push might really be the most significant drug pricing and pharmaceutical industry shift, certainly in my career. And maybe thinking back to the inception of price reporting with the Medicaid rebate program in 1991, this seems to me to be a seismic shift here in the policy foundations, really, for our industry. And it seems to me that the market doesn't yet fully appreciate what this might mean, judging from the coverage in the trade press, which has not been particularly in-depth, at least so far from what we're reading. And that might be owing to the significant complexity in these MFN policies. We're not going to go too deep into that because we could do a multi-hour podcast just on the details here. But maybe we could just catch up a little bit on what we actually saw here in 2025. So really, at least in my perception, there's been this two-pronged approach by the Trump administration. On the one hand, it's what I would call cajole and coerce, where we've seen the threat of 100% tariffs being used and the carrot of FDA priority review vouchers to compel major companies to make drug pricing so-called deals with the federal government. And I think we're up to 16 now, as I was just notified by Sabrina this morning. We've had one more announced. So now we're up to 16 deals with major companies as of the date of this recording, which is January 15th. The deals mostly remain confidential. So that's not particularly instructive for us as we're trying to advise companies or analyze what this means. But we do know with certainty that these companies that have made so-called deals all agree to participate in the future Trump RX direct-to-consumer website, and that they're participating in the otherwise voluntary generous payment model, that is the Medicaid payment model. Then on the other hand, or maybe the second prong of the two-pronged strategy, is the Trump administration pursuing we can maybe call it traditional process to impose most favored nation pricing more generally. And there've been basically two steps in that regard. So first, the generous voluntary payment model, which applies only in Medicaid, was announced on November 6th, I believe. And here there's an application deadline for manufacturers that would like to participate of March 31st, 2026. And then second, and more significantly, was the publication, as we said, on December 19th, of the mandatory Globe and Guard payment models. And these were issued in the form of proposed regulations. And like I said, they would be mandatory. And here, the comment period on these proposed rules for both of them will end on February 23rd of this year.
Yeah, Chris, and while there's certainly a lot of complexity and detail in terms of the generous, the globe, and the guard models, today, I think we want to focus more on how they may potentially interrelate with one another. So at a high level, generous is a voluntary model, and it applies to Medicaid. Globe and guard, if these proposed rules are finalized, they would be mandatory, and they would impose MFN-based rebates on Medicare Part B and Medicare Part D utilization, with Globe focusing on Part B as in boy and Guard focusing on Part D as in dog. There's a lot of nuance, and it definitely makes sense for every manufacturer to kind of look into which US drugs are eligible for these rebates and how CMS would identify the relevant ex-US drugs, as well as how those ex-US prices would be determined. On the last point, the Globe and Guard proposed rules would give manufacturers two options, either letting CMS find the ex-US prices or voluntarily reporting ex-US prices. Under the voluntary reporting option, there's some benefits associated with that. Sabrina, I know you mentioned the gross to net calculation, and these Globe and Guard rebates, if they were to be finalized, would be another important layer of consideration in that GTN or gross to net calculation. But Sabrina, over the holidays, you helped us, and we're very appreciative. You helped us focus on how these three models, the generous, the globe, and the guard, might be potentially interrelated. So I wonder if you could explain to us a bit of what that interrelationship or connection might be.
Yeah. So first of all, Chris, you mentioned, I think it's easy to try to connect the dots and assume that the manufacturers, now 16, that have deals with the Trump administration, they're agreeing to lower their prices in Medicaid to MFN prices. And as soon as those agreements started to come out, Generous came out. And so it's easy to make the assumption that those 16 manufacturers will sign up for Generous. I think we won't know until the RFAs come in. And then on the other hand, and any other manufacturer, since it's a voluntary model, can also submit RFAs and seek to participate and negotiate with CMS. So I think watching how those RFA submissions go and which actually get to negotiations and stay in the model is going to be very telling in 2026. I don't know about you guys, but I refresh the RFA every single day. And the reason for that is when Generous was published on November 6th, we've seen CMS quietly make some changes to the RFA. First of all, just a few days after it was published, CMS quietly changed how the MFN will be determined under Generous, moving from the lowest price in the basket reference country to the second lowest price. So, okay, that's helpful for manufacturers. Was glad to see that. And then on December 23rd, right before the Christmas holiday, and 4 days after publication of Globe and Guard, CMS changed the RFA again, making some changes to the reporting timeline of ex-US pricing, but most significantly, adding a new provision regarding waivers of other models.
Yeah, and I have the language right here, so it's short. Let me just read it off quickly. And what it says is, to ensure that data from the generous model can be accurately evaluated and are not affected by potential distortions or confounding variables from overlapping participation in other models, CMS may, at its discretion, waive or modify the applicability of other CMMI models or model requirements. Any such waivers shall be provided for in generous model participation agreements.
All right, so Chris just read us this cryptic, or maybe not so cryptic phrase. Sabrina, how do you view this provision?
Yeah, I've heard leadership in CMS say this in some closed door forums of tying the three together and tying those to the manufacturer deals. And I think we'll have to wait and see how it plays out. But it could point to the fact that if a manufacturer participates in Generous, they could be exempt from Globe and Guard. And I think how that's played out and who it's applied to, depending on who submits an RFA for generous, we have yet to see. But that reference to any such waivers shall be provided for in the generous models pharmaceutical agreement. Hopefully, CMS will post those and make them public information before the RFAs are due. And I think hopefully we'll get more answers.
Yeah, I view the provision the same way. And I had kind of set up here our MFN discussion by speaking of these two prongs of the Trump strategy, the cajole and coerce, and then this more traditional rulemaking. And here we might be seeing how these two are really kind of flowing into each other. First, because the 16 manufacturers with deals, as we believe, are participating in the voluntary generous model. And then secondly, because the Globe and Guard burdens could be the sticks to, let's just say, motivate other manufacturers to also sign up for generous. So we're seeing this interconnection of these different models. We're seeing some parallels with using tariffs as a stick and FDA priority review vouchers as a carrot. We're seeing some other sticks here coming on the table and carrots in the model and rulemaking space. Sabrina, any final thoughts on generous, Globe, and Guard and how they might overlap with existing other federal programs?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I don't think I could read any new policy without thinking about 340B and duplicate discounts. I'm such a 340B data nerd. I can't help myself. And I have a lot of concerns as I read Generous and also as I read Globe and Guard. First, on Generous, they're very silent on duplicate discounts. And to me, that means it's business as usual in terms of how manufacturers are already subject to Medicaid duplicate discounts. And in some instances, states are not even providing claims level details so a manufacturer can verify they're not being exposed to duplicate discounts in Medicaid. I think that just amplifies when you start talking MFN level supplemental rebates in the Medicaid program, and it's going to put those pressures there around duplicate discounts. And then in Globe and Guard, while the models do specify at least some kind of methodology for not subjecting manufacturers to 340B duplicate discounts, we already know those methods are not effective. And, it's not really clear the path that manufacturers would have to validate the invoices. And even if they would get the detail in the invoices to know if they're being subject to 340B duplicate discounts. So I think duplicate discounts in 340B, and because of the growth of the program, has to be considered when you look across these three models.
Yeah, Sabrina, thanks for those insights. That definitely makes sense. So there's a lot to track here going into 2026. And I would say this reminds me of when the IRA had just been enacted and we were recommending to organizations set up a task force, get the right stakeholders together at the table to cooperate and track these developments and map the impacts and bring in outside resources for support as necessary. And all of that, of course, goes back to the gross to net analysis, Sabrina, that you mentioned at the outset. These developments add another layer to when you look at your gross to net review for your product.
Thanks, Chris. So we're coming to the end of our podcast, and it seems like a major takeaway from Sabrina is to expect a lot to happen in 2026 and to be prepared, which is not something new. It's something we've actually said a lot of times on this podcast. So with that, why don't we go to our favorite question, the question that we posed at the very beginning: which Olympic sport is it like? And Sabrina, since you are our esteemed guest today, what Olympic sport did you select?
Yeah, thank you, Danny. Representing the year ahead for life sciences companies, I chose the half pipe in snowboarding. As the description of the event, it's where each competitor aims to perform a variety of the most difficult tricks while getting the highest amplitude off of the slope of the half pipe, all within a short or limited U-shaped course made of hard-packed snow. Wow, would that hurt if you fell? I mentioned the short course because of the IRA MFP, quote unquote, negotiation timeline and the pressure for pharmaceutical manufacturers to reach peak revenue sooner than they normally would have.
I love your choice, Sabrina. I'm a big snowboarding fan. Not the falling part, of course. I picked another Winter Olympic sport as well with the Winter Olympics coming up, the skeleton, which you may or may not have heard about, but it's a sliding sport where the athlete basically barrels down headfirst down an icy track on a little sled. They basically start with a sprint and a push, and then they kind of steer their bodies to reach speeds of over 80 miles per hour. So scary stuff, again, like snowboarding. But talking with you two about specifically Globe and Guard, the two new mandatory models, it just makes me think of how drug price controls are coming down faster than we've seen in a long time. So that's what I'm going with, skeleton. Chris, what Olympic sport did you select?
Yeah, I love how you both kind of went with the obviously dangerous things where you can break your neck. It's very clear to me. I picked something where there's a lot more nuance, just like there's all this crazy nuance in Globe, Guard, and Generous, and that is curling. And if you've ever watched curling, you kind of wonder, what are they doing? There's a little bit of motion, and then there's scrubbing of the ice to make things glide further. And it's a team sport, and these teams have to be very well coordinated to make these small movements and very careful strategic choices, really. And that's what I feel is what we need to do here with the MFN policies. So, these teams are scoring by sliding their so-called stones onto the field towards this thing called the center of the house. We certainly need to have our initiatives with the House and Senate here this year as well. If there's a tie, they play further. It's 10 rounds. So it's kind of protracted process, not a sprint, more like a marathon. All of that looks to me like that's what 2026 might look like. And just like curling doesn't seem to sort of open itself up to the casual observer without kind of studying some of the rules, same with Globe and Guard and Generous. You cannot kind of browse through that quickly and read a one-page summary and feel like you have a handle. Unfortunately, especially with Globe and Guard, speaking for myself, it came out as a beautiful Christmas present on the 19th, and it took a number of days for me to read it multiple times until I felt now I could really give some advice on this, right? And that's what 2026 might just look like. Have cross-functional teams ready, track the developments, analyze the developments, bring in outside resources when necessary, just like curling. And I think that nicely wraps up our podcast for today. And usually with that, we turn to Danny to ask, where are we going for the after party? But without saying too much, I will just say that Sabrina is very well connected with the culinary scene here in DC, and she has a whole other area of related expertise. And that's why, since we are fortunate to have Sabrina here today, I will turn to you, Sabrina, and say, where are we going for the after party?
Thanks, Chris. So it's a sunny day here in DC, and it's January when most people are cleansing or turning to health. So I chose Lamani, which is down at the wharf in DC. It's right on the waterfront. It's Greek. And I could just picture the lovely whole fish and roasted vegetables that we're going to enjoy.
Sabrina, that sounds great. I can't wait to go. Thanks to Sabrina for joining us today and sharing her thoughts and insights regarding the momentous developments in 2025 and how they may impact the industry and the many related stakeholders into 2026. And thanks to Danny for being a moderator.
Thank you so much, Chris and Danny.
Thanks, Chris. It was a pleasure to be here again.
And thank you to our listeners for checking out the Latham & Watkins Drug Pricing and Market Access series, which was part of our Connected with Latham podcast. You can subscribe and listen to new and archived episodes of Latham's podcasts on lw.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen to podcasts. If you have questions or would like additional information, please email us using the links located in the show description. We hope you'll join us again next time.
This podcast is provided as a service of Latham & Watkins, LLP. Listening to this podcast does not create an attorney-client relationship between you and Latham & Watkins, LLP, and you should not send confidential information to Latham & Watkins, LLP. While we make every effort to assure that the content of this podcast is accurate, comprehensive, and current, we do not warrant or guarantee any of those things. And you may not rely on this podcast as a substitute for legal research and/or consulting a qualified attorney. Listening to this podcast is not a substitute for engaging a lawyer to advise you on your individual needs. Should you require legal advice on the issues covered in this podcast, please consult a qualified attorney. Under New York's Code of Professional Responsibility, portions of this communication contain attorney advertising. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. Results depend upon a variety of factors unique to each representation. Please direct all inquiries regarding the conduct of Latham & Watkins attorneys under the New York's disciplinary rules to Latham & Watkins, LLP, 1271 Avenue of the Americas, New York, New York, 10020. Phone number 1-212-906-1200.